Welcome to this Community Consultation Forum hosted by VCOSS in collaboration with the Taxi Industry Inquiry. I'm Catherine Santo, I'm an independent consultant and I'd like to warmly welcome you to this very important community forum this morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to thank each of you for taking the time to come today. It's an amazing crowd that we have gathered here, and I think already that tells us something about just how important this topic is. We have a very broad range of people in this room. This is primarily a consultation forum for service users, but we also have a large number of people from community service organisations, advocacy groups, state government departments, local government, the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commissioner, people from the Taxi Inquiry. I think we have the entire staff here of the Taxi Inquiry today, which is fantastic to listen to you. And we also have members of the taxi industry present. So an extraordinarily diverse range of people to come and talk about what's important in the taxi industry at present and to start to identify the sorts of things that you'd like to see change. So we're looking forward to some fantastic discussions throughout the course of the forum. I'd just like to take you through briefly the agenda so you have a sense of how things are going to flow throughout the course of the next few hours. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Kath Smith, who is the Chief Executive Officer of VCOSS, and she's going to formally welcome you to today's proceedings. And from there, we are very fortunate to have Professor Allan Fels, who is the Chair of the Victorian Taxi Industry Inquiry, and he's here to both present to you and talk to you about what's happening with the inquiry and also to engage in some discussion with you. From there, we'd like to hand over to you, really, for the rest of the forum and to seek, firstly, your experiences in relation to using taxi services and what from that is working well from your perspective and what are the things that you'd like to be considered as issues that need to change. That will be followed by some lunch, which no doubt you'll be looking forward to at that stage. And from there, we'd like to move into thinking, well, how do you improve the taxi services? Having heard those stories and those experiences, what are the things that are important to you? What are the most important things so we can have a sense of the priorities? And what are the sorts of things that might bring about the kind of changes that you might be seeking? So all of those discussions, you'll have a facilitator, so someone to volunteer to be a facilitator on your table. It's really important that we get to capture all of the views around the room here today. And at the end, Kath and Allan will summarise what's been heard and discussed and give you an idea of what the next steps will be from here, having given us all that information. It's important to know what will happen with that information and what you can expect as the process unfolds. So that's our agenda for the next 3 hours together. Can I just indicate a little bit of housekeeping for you? We have attendant carers present. Can I ask those people to identify themselves? 1, 2, 3, down this end of the room. 4, 5, thank you very much. Okay, can everyone see at least one attendant carer? Good, okay, so please make yourselves known if you require any assistance. We have tea and coffee stations at both ends of the room and lunch will be provided at both ends of the room. And we also have toilets at both ends of the room. So just down near where you came in and also up this end past those spare tables is another set of toilets. Please let me know as your facilitator if there's anything else that you need throughout the course of the session so that I can support your full contributions. So let's begin now, and I would like to welcome and introduce Kath Smith, the CEO of VCOSS, to formally welcome you to today's forum. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you very much, Catherine. Now, I'm just aware about just making sure everyone's comfortable. The reason I was calling to the signer was because there's a number of signers, a number of people who are watching you on screen. So if you can stand close to the speaker, it means that everyone can see you as well as the people in your direct eye line. Again, just to reinforce what Catherine said, if anyone has any needs during the morning, do please speak up and or talk to people around you in order that we can maximise your participation. Yes, I'm formally and warmly welcoming you to this event this morning. We've been, I wouldn't say surprised, but delighted by the level of interest. This inquiry into necessary improvements into Victoria's taxi services comes at a really good time from VCOSS's point of view. We have a long interest in access issues, particularly across the transport system, but in particular around taxis in terms of both affordability and physical access, and just making sure that our taxi system is doing what it can to support the mobility needs of all Victorians, in particular people who are mobility impaired or people who for one reason or another are not well placed to use other forms of transport. So from our point of view, this is a fantastic opportunity to improve taxi services for disadvantaged Victorians, and we warmly encourage your participation and input. VCOSS will be actively gathering and I suppose filtering and pursuing and hopefully persuading and encouraging change as government considers these issues. So really it's just for me to welcome you, to say that VCOSS is very interested in this. I'm very happy that you're all here. I'll talk again at the end of the morning around what the next steps might be and some of the threads that are coming up during the morning. And we'll, I hope, have a really wide-ranging discussion. Some of you may or may not have noticed that on your tables you've all got a copy of a little paper around improving taxi services for mobility disadvantaged Victorians. And so any of you that haven't seen that or are interested in that, just be aware there is some background material, and there's further background material, swathes of background material, if you're interested. But I think I won't hold us up anymore. I think what we'll do now is I'll invite you to welcome the keynote speaker, who's the chair of the Victorian Taxi Industry Inquiry, Professor Allan Fels. Please welcome Allan.
Thanks very much, Kath. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here today, and I'd like to thank VCOSS for helping us arrange this event and for so many of you coming. And in fact, that reflects what we've already picked up. We invited submissions, kind of formal submissions, and a very large fraction of the submissions we've received have come in on the subject of people with disabilities, the question of also wheelchair accessible taxis, which is part of that issue, and so on. So we do detect a real level of community interest and concern in this matter. So what I'm going to do briefly today is to tell you a little bit about the inquiry, mention a few of the issues which are mentioned in that paper that Kath has mentioned and that many of you have seen, that we've already heard about in relation to disability and taxis, and maybe I'll take a couple of questions afterwards if you want, and then I think we're going to break up, and we're extremely interested to hear from you what you think about things, what are your concerns and suggestions for improvement. So the position is that the government has asked me to do a 12-month review of the taxi and hire industry and to recommend reforms to improve the services provided by taxis and hire cars. And we, of course, already know that people with impaired mobility due to frailty, illness or disability are among the most frequent and reliant users of taxis. And for those who can't drive or access other forms of public transport, taxis may be the only way to get out and about. And many people have stressed to us already that taxis give them the independence that they would otherwise not have. We know that the major players in the taxi industry have always had a very strong voice in debates about taxi services and the actions of government. I encourage you, as one of the biggest consumer groups, to put forward an equally strong voice and make sure that your concerns and ideas are heard today and throughout the inquiry. The performance of wheelchair accessible taxis, WATS, and the multi-purpose taxi program is a specific requirement that we consider in our terms of reference. Right. We also want to think beyond the current system and ask what alternatives there might be to provide door-to-door transport to mobility disadvantaged people. This will include the potential future role of taxis, especially with an ageing population who will need more taxi-like services to move around and remain active. All of those issues are interlinked with our broader task to review the taxi industry as a whole. So some of the key problems that have been identified so far come from the fact that, as I said, more than 25% of the 140 submissions received come from advocacy groups or organisations concerned about taxi accessibility. And we're picking this up from lots of other sources and from non-submissions coming in on email and Twitter and Facebook and all that kind of thing. So it was no surprise to me that those who rely and use taxis the most have very strong views on the industry. And many people shared their stories of poor and unreliable service, at least in a fair number of instances. And it's clear to me at this stage that the standard of taxi service experienced by people with mobility issues often falls short of what is available to the wider community or what would be desirable for them. We can group at this stage the main problems into about 10 areas, although that's exactly what we want to hear about from you today, whether we've caught everything and what you think about this. First, taxis are unreliable and people needing wheelchair accessible taxis are often waiting far too long for their booked taxi to arrive. Second, some drivers are unwilling or don't know how to assist or communicate with mobility disadvantaged people. Third, there are not enough taxi services in outer metropolitan Melbourne, rural and regional Victoria. Fourth, some feel unsafe and vulnerable during the journey, perhaps because their wheelchair is not properly secured in the taxi or they are worried about being overcharged. Fifth, some taxi drivers refuse to pick up people who they suspect will only require a short trip. Six, hailing taxis or selecting taxis from a rank is difficult for those requiring a wheelchair accessible taxi, and people with assistant animals are still being refused service. 7, taxi travel is too expensive for some, even with the multi-purpose taxi program, the MPTP subsidy. 8, some taxi users find the existing payment methods difficult to handle. 9, some people have difficulty booking a taxi using the automated service. And 10, the complaints process is confusing and people report inadequate follow-up for people making complaints. Now, while some of these problems are specific to mobility disadvantaged users, most of them are also experienced to some degree by the wider community. The inquiry has learned that many people who use taxis on a regular basis manage to avoid these problems by booking their taxis privately with a known driver. Well, I guess we all know of that phenomenon. And while some people really value a positive and personal relationship with their driver, and that these arrangements generally work very well, they also have disadvantages. Relying on specific taxi drivers may limit the flexibility of the service for the customer, and it further reduces the supply of accessible service taxis for those who use the network. And I also question the system if people need to negotiate a personal transport service instead of being able to rely on an effective public taxi service. So, turning to challenges facing the industry, systemic issues relating to the underlying structure, the regulation, the economics of the taxi industry are the cause of many difficulties, both for users and for suppliers. These issues are a key focus of the inquiry, and I think that everyone here today has an interest in the wider system, just like everyone else. We know that a good deal of the payment, the revenue made from taxis, goes to seemingly invisible people who don't actually do the frontline delivery of service to customers. For example, people who invest in acquiring a license and then immediately assign that license to a taxi operator without ever seeing a car, then doing so for large sums of money. They get part of your fare and they carry no significant responsibilities for what happens after that point of assignment. So we're asking the question, what value do these players provide in good quality service delivery? Now, turning to other jurisdictions, there are a range of accessible transport models in other countries. For example, shared ride taxi bus services for the elderly that have emerged under an open or less regulated market environment. In other places, governments have contracted out services in order to meet public transport objectives. And countries we've highlighted to you in that paper excuse me, include New Zealand, London, the Netherlands. And you have that worksheet that does briefly outline the systems of some other countries, and I think you'll probably be discussing them further in this forum. Just a few kind of thought starters. We could look at those models and ask if they might work well in Victoria. Although we want to go back and look at what the problem is and think through all imaginable solutions. We can also ask specific questions such as, well, what would happen if we removed some regulation to allow a more open and competitive taxi market whilst maintaining a strong safety and quality control? If some controls were taken away, would the industry have greater availability of taxis? Would there be more taxis come on the road and be available? Would the industry become more competitive and thus provide better service and more innovative service to users? Would it lead to more cabs, reduced fares, shorter waiting times, a greater range of services? Also, the question to contemplate is, how can the role of taxis be broadened and better adapted to the communities they service? Should taxis be allowed to be more flexible so that they can offer different types of services like shared rides or trips with a fixed fee? Should we invest in a universally accessible taxi vehicle design? Should the ultimate goal be to introduce a new design of taxi that suits everybody in the community? Would simply adding more watts to the Victorian taxi fleet lead to more reliable service? Is the answer to introduce more regulation and enforceable standards? Could new and stricter regulations improve service delivery to people with mobility disadvantage? For example, obliging drivers to provide an itemised receipt after each journey, or positioning the driver ID and fare meter close to wheelchair users at the back of the vehicle. Could we establish a central booking service which can retain important customer information? If a database was maintained to share such information with drivers when jobs were booked, or to link customers with particular drivers, users may not need to set up private arrangements with drivers. Would this arrangement work? Do we need a centralised and independent complaints handling process? Or should we put that more heavily on networks or combinations of drivers? What elements of a complaint system are needed to ensure providers are held to account? What are the consequences of reform? Recommendations at the end of the reform could lead to a period of transition with some short-term instability. All of these consequences will have to be taken into account when deciding on reform for the industry as the government wants us to come up with. What I'll seek to recommend to the Victorian government is the best model for regulating the taxi and hire car industry in the future, and any transitional measures necessary to get there. So let me make it clear that at this stage I do not have a clear view on what the answers are. I have done some inquiries in the past where I'm pretty clear on day one what the answer is likely to be. This one, I do have an open mind on what needs to be done, and that makes me more interested in hearing more deeply from you what you see the challenges and problems as being, and any ideas you have on what would be useful steps to deal, particularly with the question of disability, wheelchair accessible taxis, multi-purpose taxi payment systems, and a range of other challenges that face people who have to rely on taxis for their transport. So thank you for coming. This is a great chance for us at the inquiry, not just me, but our staff here, to hear from you, and for VCOSS for getting you all together, and for it also to be thinking about kind of assembling your views. I'm hoping that there will be a reporting process today, I know there will be, in which your views are captured and organised and put forward to us. So thank you again for coming. If anyone wanted to ask a question or two right now, I'd be happy to try and deal with them.